For this next chart of the Search for Truth lesson, we'll be looking specifically at the Ten Commandments, right? So what happened at this point was that God has led the Israelites to Mount Sinai, where we have many of you are familiar with this event called the giving of the Ten Commandments, right? So this is where God first gave the Israelites specific rules, specific laws about how to live for Him, how to live in relationship with Him. Now, bear in mind, prior to these Ten Commandments or this season where uh, God's commandments were given, there wasn't any previous occasion whereby God gave specific commandments or set of teachings for His believers to follow by. So this is really, in many ways, significant because it's the first time God began to give a group of people his specific ideas of how they should live for Him. Now, when we look at the Ten Commandments, I think the first impression most people have is a list of do's and don'ts, right? So I hope through this lesson we see something beyond that. Now, if you look at the Ten Commandments, you realize that it can be loosely divided into two categories of commandments, right? So the first being 1 to 4 here, and then the next being 5 to 10, right? So I'll elaborate further what I mean by two categories of commandments. Now, the first category of commandments, the first four commandments, thou shalt not have other gods before me, or God saying that there should be no other God that people should worship. Number two, people should not make any images of Him. Number three, people should not take His name in vain. Number four, people should observe the Sabbath day. Really, these particular commandments are really focused on a person's relationship with God, right? So how a person should be relating to God in terms of the way they live, and I'll elaborate further. Whereas the next category, or the commandments 5 to 10, right, you can look at these as really focusing on man's relationship with one another, right? So you can see 10 commandments really, if I were to take a step back, it is not just rules and regulations, but really about ways of which people should relate to God and how people should relate to men. If I were to take a look at them a bit more closely and ask ourselves what are some applications we can use for our lives today. Number one, when we talk about God commanding us not to have any other gods before Him, that means that people should not be worshipping other gods when they worship Him. What God is asking for us is to be devoted. God is asking us to be faithful to Him, right? That means when we consider Him to be our God, we should be the only God and none others. When God tells us not to make any images of Him, in many ways we are really asked not to limit God. Now, if you think about it, when you have a statue or an image of a certain god or a certain creature, right? Basically, you're saying this is the form that they have, right? And many times these forms are imperfect. Sometimes, in certain cases, these forms might give people a very wrong impression, or really an impression of who God is when He's not meant to be, right? So I think when we talk about what God is, who God is, God says He is eternal. He's the Alpha and Omega, is the beginning and the end. He's not limited by time and space. To put Him and try to categorize Him in a picture or some form, God is basically saying let's not limit Him, right? Next, when we say God, when God says we shall not take His name in vain, it's really about not dishonoring Him, right? If you think about it today, if someone insults someone whom we love, our parents, so on and so forth, we will feel upset because we feel that we are getting disrespected. It's unfortunate that in popular culture and media, the name of the Lord Jesus is used like a swear word or like a punctuation, right? And people are using it to evoke a reaction, to evoke laughter, so on and so forth. And this is really, really a form of dishonor and disrespect to the Lord. Now, the fourth commandment about keeping the Sabbath day holy. Now we know for the Jews, or rather for the Israelites back then, they were asked that on they will work 6 days a week, and on the seventh day they rested, as a way to remember that God rested from His work. Really, it's to take that day, and the Israelites were commanded to make sure that for one day in a week they are not to be bothered and busy about their own affairs, but to really give God priority, to worship Him, to take that day as a day of thanksgiving, as a day of celebration. So for us, in our context today, is to make sure that we make time to give God priority and to put Him first. The next set of commandments is about relationships, right relationships with men or with our fellow mankind. Now, rather than trying to link them individually, I think when you look at the fact that we are asked to honor our parents, when we are asked to not take life, not to be unfaithful, not to take what doesn't belong to us, not to lie, not to desire things that do not belong to us. Really, when we take a step back, it's about respecting people that we are with, people whom we have a chance to be interacting with, or even people as a whole. Do we give honor? Do we respect people for who they are? Do we show them the right dignity? Do we give mercy where mercy is needed? Do we conduct ourselves with integrity? So I think this one modern day application we can make really is really about the way we deal with people. And if we were to deal with people and see them as created in God's image, then we should be respecting them, honoring them, showing them mercy where mercy is possible, and to conduct ourselves in integrity. So I think these are just some possible applications. Now, if I will try to make a link between the Old Testament and the New Testament. So in the Old Testament, which many people consider back then under the law, right, of which God gave them the 10 Commandments and many other laws, God commanded them, these are things I want you to pay attention to. I want you to pay attention to right relationships with me. I want you to pay attention to right relationships with fellow mankind. In the New Testament, Jesus actually quoted the Old Testament and basically says, everything that the Israelites and the Jews have learned about the 10 Commandments and many of the other commandments they've passed on over the generations, really the focus is about loving God and loving man. And I think the way Jesus says it ties it up very nicely upon all these two commandments of loving God and loving others, right? Everything else hinges on these two. In other words, God has always wanted people to remember the main reason why we keep the commandments. We keep the commandments out of love for God and out of love for men, right? So, and in closing for this slide, if you think about it, many times when we look at the 10 Commandments, we think of rules and regulations, but God's rules, so to speak, have always been focused on right relationships. All right, so that's all we have for this chart. Thank you.